Hello friends, back again with the next topic of the day. Very relevant today. We're going to talk about St. Patrick and what we actually accept as true of his history and what has been perpetuated as a myth. And then I kind of want to talk about myths in general, because the book that I use to do my lunar rituals and learn about my Celtic ancestors is called Celtic Myth and Magic. And so, myths are still very powerful and they still affect the course of history. And I feel like there is always a grain of truth somewhere in a myth. So, without further hesitation, I'm just going to jump right into what the accepted history is of St. Patrick. What have we kind of narrowed down after ruling out things that kind of contradicted each other and have been accepted as not true? So what's left? Basically, seems that he was kidnapped as a child by pagan raiders and brought into Ireland, where he worked as a slave, I guess, and he was held there against his will. But while he was there, he apparently absorbed knowledge of their beliefs and customs, and a lot of Ireland at that time was still functioning under a pagan religion or some sort of system that, works off of nature. And the contradiction comes in when you find evidence that there already were Christian practices at that time that predate when St. Patrick came back to Ireland after he escaped captivity. He studied more about Christianity, and then he came back to Ireland, and he was able to mix in some of the knowledge that he had absorbed from the pagan traditions and beliefs and incorporate it into what he learned about Christianity. So he kind of borrowed some things to then teach the people of Ireland about this kind of new brand of the Christian religion. And it's really interesting, honestly, because he's not the first one to have done something like that. So you can't really put all the blame on him for getting things a little mixed up. Although some myths that may have been perpetuated by the man himself are pretty far-fetched and ridiculous, and I'll bring that up in just a little bit. But lots of contradicting information about what is real and what is just a story that was made up to excite people. All this contradicting information could mean that the truth is still hidden somewhere in there. But the fact that Ireland's history specifically relied so much on oral legends passed down by bards in the form of song, it's a consequence of Ireland being a culture that's built around an appreciation for art and creativity. And that aspect of their culture is what, in my opinion, helped them survive in general. Just so many hardships throughout history that they had to deal with. And the fact that they didn't have a widely used written language or literacy to be able to still pass things down, knowledge and these stories that, whether they're true or not, whether these deities are actually real in the flesh or if they're just, allegories. The fact that they still persist just through passing them down orally is pretty impressive, honestly. And so, to be able to do that, they had to be creative. And so they made poems and songs and they made art to represent all of these things. And that is basically what we use to read into their history. And that's just incredible to me, because along the same timeline, other parts of Europe were using written language already, and so there's documented records of what was going on, what they were doing, whereas that is not the case in Ireland at that time, until Christianity really came in full force and they started teaching that in school. And that's a whole thing then, where they then learned English because of the Anglo-Saxon influence. And for a while there was an erasure of Celtic heritage and the Gaelic language. And that book, The Irish World, that I read from the other day, they go into incredible detail about all that stuff, so that will be for another day. I'll read out of that. But I wanted to also read a little segment that I found online when I was doing some research on St. Patrick that I think sums up what I'm trying to say here about him. Nothing is clearer than that Patrick engrafted Christianity on the pagan superstitions with so much skill that he won the people over to the Christian religion before they understood the exact difference between the two systems of beliefs. And much of this half-pagan, half-Christian religion will be found not only in the Irish stories of the Middle Ages, but in the superstitions of present day. And that is absolutely true. Even if you look at the upcoming spring equinox celebration, Estra, which was adopted into Celtic tradition from Anglo-Saxon influence. They liked it, and so they adopted it into their Sabbath kind of calendar. So there you go. I mean, St. Patrick wasn't the first one, like I said, to borrow something that he liked and use it to his advantage. So, I think it's worth acknowledging that, because it's not always a bad thing, unless you just want to be a purist. And like, what even is that at this point? Because things are constantly changing and evolving, and if you if you don't just get with the program, then you're gonna get left behind, basically. So yeah, I just think it's really interesting, and so I wanted to share. And I also think it's really interesting that the actual mythological characters that are recognized in the Celtic pantheon, who knows how much of that is taken from actual events that happened and how much is just totally, some of the stuff is pretty fantastical. But the important thing to learn from reading these stories is lessons. So not taking it as literal, but still honoring the details of the story, because they are all important little details that create this picture, that create a story. And you know, that is what art really is. Different forms of art are just basically ways for you to communicate something, tell a story, that sort of thing. So there are a few deities that I just want to mention because they mentioned St. Patrick, and so why not bring it full circle back into the Celtic pantheon, so you can see how he learned about some of these deities that were being honored and worshipped in that time period through the pagan ideology, and he kind of appropriated them and made it all about Christianity. So, you know, the fact that he did that just means that now we have things like, you know, the snakes, like druids being snakes, like, you know, like the myth that St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland. Actually, I wanted to bring that up because that is one of the myths in here for my boy Finn McCool. And I think it's a good time to bring him up also because not only is it, you know, the next solar celebration since Yule, the winter solstice. That's when Yule is celebrated. And Finn McCool is the main archetype that is celebrated during Yule. Because he is a sleeping giant god. And so he just stays asleep for pretty much like most of the year until he is called upon to basically battle. And that's like the battle between day and night, you know, when we have the longest night of the year. So at that point of the winter solstice, when the day is trying to overcome the night, we finally break that threshold of the days are no longer getting shorter, now they're getting longer. So that's what that represents, you know. I just think it's kind of neat. It's a fun story. I remember actually reading storybooks about Finn McCool as a kid, so he's a pretty popular figure. And I'll just read what it says in here for you. Finn plays a leading role in Irish mythology, appearing in many stories, even when only in cameo. Finn is the legendary giant god warrior of Ireland who foresaw the coming of the Milesians and banished an invading giant from Scotland. He married Grain, a master herbalist and sun goddess, who was the daughter of King Cormac, but he went on to take many other wives and lovers, including Fand, a fairy queen. He took over the leadership of the Fianna from his father. When he was a child, he burned his finger on the salmon of knowledge, which his teacher, Finnegas, had unknowingly given him. He sucked on the burn and instantly acquired vast knowledge and wisdom. So that's why I made salmon for Yule, and I used some of that. I did like a whole ritual with it, honestly. And I'm going to be making salmon again. That's what I'm making tonight for dinner. I already have it marinating in the fridge right now. And so I'm just going to eat some salmon to honor Finn McCool. And so yeah, one of Finn's earliest achievements was the creation of Loch Ness in Northern Ireland, which he scooped out with his two bare hands and tossed into the Irish Sea, where it became the Isle of Man. So, yeah, probably that didn't actually literally happen. But it's fun. It's fun imagery, isn't it? He later destroyed all of Ireland's serpents, a story later appropriated by St. Patrick, which represents the destruction of druidic power. It may also be a patriarchal legend which symbolizes the dismantling of feminine power with which the serpent has been long associated. See, that's really interesting right there. So the legend of Finn McCool driving the serpents out was basically to represent a masculine energy overcoming the feminine power that had been kind of ruling over things, and so the patriarchy was kind of taking over at that point, and that's what that symbolizes. But then St. Patrick used that story and that imagery for himself to represent driving out the druids, which were the ones who came up with that imagery to begin with. So, kind of funny. And it also says here, Finn killed the snakes only when they rose up and threatened to eat the island's food supply. Not gonna even say anything about that, but so legends say he lived for 200 years. It is a long-standing Irish tradition to honor his memory at the Yule Sabbath. So it's not traditional to celebrate him right now during this time of year specifically, but I want to start acknowledging him and his presence and those lessons and what he represents in preparation for this next full moon, which is at the end of March in a few weeks. And he is one of the deities that is represented by the energy of this next full moon. So that is why I wanted to bring him up. And he can teach us about wisdom, overcoming enemies, creation, protection, knowledge, and divination. So that is where the snakes in Ireland legend comes from. Isn't that interesting? Going a little more into that snake serpent imagery, like I said, or like I read, that was to symbolize feminine power. So there's actually another feminine deity that I wanted to bring up. Where's she at? Caravag. A local crone goddess from County Meath who was turned into a huge snake for eating forbidden berries. Her original purpose as a goddess is lost to us because her stories became absorbed by Christian legends which attempt to make her a Celtic Eve, like in the creation story, Adam and Eve. They tell us that St. Patrick killed her with holy water, which melted her like a witch, from which she will rise again. As persistent as the Eve Caravag image is to the modern mind, hers is a story about the acceptance of self-responsibility, not one of punishment. How about that? So, yeah, it's a very masculine idea to, like, be disciplined, and it's a much more feminine ideal to just assume responsibility and, kind of move on, offering forgiveness and being gentle with yourself rather than just being really disciplined. So I think that's what you can take away from that character. And it also says here, feminist researcher Patricia Monahan believes St. Patrick may have been the one who tampered with this legend, one of many about a virgin goddess of spring who banished each year the crone she would eventually become in order to further his own aims. So, like I said, he liked how that sounded. He thought, that's cool. that'll really grab people. I can get them to believe that if I hook them in with this goddess that they really seem to care about. And so that's what he did. And so now we don't really know exactly what she was celebrated for, but we do know that origin of the story, and we can just use context to figure out our own lesson from that. So she's also can be used to call upon for seasonal rites, so I thought it was a good time. Being St. Patrick's Day, set the record straight, number one. Number two, it's going to be the spring equinox soon. So here's another one. And I just have two more I want to bring up real quick. When I was looking up this one, because I was in the index looking for St. Patrick, any mentions of him, and that's how I found these guys. I was so drawn to Caridwen that I just had to write it down. And then it ended up, I feel like, tying into the whole theme that I have been going for with this little segment here. So Caridwen is a sow goddess famous for her great cauldron of knowledge. So much like Finn McCool, who was the masculine deity who had gained knowledge from the great salmon, Caridwen has her own great cauldron of knowledge. She's brewing her own knowledge up, which I think is kind of cool. She is also a moon and grain deity with many crone and mother attributes. Her cauldron's name was Amen, which her potion of wisdom called Greel was made. The origin of the Halloween image of the cauldron stirring witch and witch's brew. So she's actually another deity that is celebrated during a Sabbath holiday, but it's not Yule, it's the one before that, which is Samhain. So that's like Halloween. So once I realized that, who it was when I was reading it, I'm like, oh, I think it's cool to not only just bring in the last Sabbath energy of Yule, but then even the one before that, because I see it as a pattern that I've kind of been following since then. Since the beginning of November, I've really been focusing on flow. And so I saw this as a good opportunity to go back and bring this full circle to acknowledge Caridwen again, as I did during Samhain when I kind of started this journey. So where did I leave off there? To make her potion of knowledge, the brew had to simmer for a year and a day. This is a common passage of time in Celtic lore and the source of the traditional study period before formal initiation. Her servant, Gian, was sent to take care of it, but splashed some on his fingers. Without thinking, he licked his fingers and ingested 3 drops of the potion. Sounds familiar. So it's kind of like a feminine, masculine parallel, these two characters. Instantly, he gained all knowledge, including that of being able to see into the future and past, and he knew he had to flee. Caridwen discovered this and pursued him through many forms until, when Gian became a speck of grain, she became a chicken and consumed him. The grain took root, and she gave birth to him as the great bard Taliesin. What the fuck? That story is crazy. So yeah, I doubt that literally happened, but some pagans believe this mystic chase relates to various levels of druidic initiation rites, and it parallels the teaching of Merlin to the young King Arthur as he is allowed to inhabit various animal bodies in order to gain knowledge. So, you know, being able to shapeshift and to just shift into different forms and states of being to be able to navigate whatever you're going through and to get the job done. So there's a lesson right there that you can extrapolate from that. Caridwen lived on an island in Lake Tegid with her children. She is often equated with the famous Greek crone Hecate and to the Irish Bad. She is also sometimes related to the Greek muses, only in a more violent and dark form. So, yeah. I just had to include her as well. And then the last deity that I want to bring up, which I will come back to at the end of this little segment on Saturday, is Estra, which is the goddess that was adopted into Celtic culture from actually German influence. So they already had this spring equinox goddess, and it kind of just really fit really well into the Celtic ideology, the pagan ideology of celebrating nature and natural cycles, solar celebrations, which is like what the Sabbath is. So they just absorbed it and became a very highly respected figure in the Celtic pantheon. And that's also where we get traditional Easter symbolism from. So, I know it's not quite Christian Easter yet, that's not for a few more weeks, but Estra, which is the traditional Easter kind of celebration of spring, which is where the Easter stereotypical kind of symbols come from. It was originally and is still traditionally celebrated during the spring equinox. So, Estra is an Anglo-Saxon goddess, the one for whom the Ostra Sabbath is named. When the Saxons invaded Britain, they brought this vigorous goddess with them, and she was eventually adopted into the Celtic pantheon. She is seen as spring personified, a goddess of rebirth, new beginnings, and fertility. The word for animal menstruation, estrus, meaning fertile period, is derived from her name. And as such, she is also a goddess of animal reproduction. The Christian holiday of Easter is also her namesake, and the concept of the Easter Bunny came from another of her legends. I read up on that, and I don't know if there's different versions of the legends. There probably are, because that's just how this shit is. But the version that I read was that she was so admired by all of the creatures of the forest or the land that they all were trying to impress her for this, like, spring equinox, to celebrate her and her embodiment of spring. And the rabbit gathered an egg and painted it so that he would be favored over all the other creatures. And she really loved that. She said, "That's great. Why don't you do more of them and hand them out to everybody? Give one to everyone. Everyone deserves one." So you have painted eggs being delivered by an Easter bunny. Crazy. But yeah, that's a fun little story. So, and that's the thing. Fun stories with cool imagery and symbolism that teach you a lesson. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't have to be something that really actually happened. It can just be inspired by something that happened, or it can just come right out of your imagination, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So that's why I think it's worthwhile to go back and retell these things, keep the oral tradition alive. So those are all of the Celtic deities that I wanted to discuss for this little period of time. And I just also wanted to wrap up saying that the Sabbath holidays, which are lining up obviously with the solstice and equinox dates, they are solar celebrations. obviously. So it represents our access to energy. So, during Yule, didn't have a whole lot of access to the sun's energy. So acknowledging that and being able to celebrate it in different ways and honor that time of year and how much energy we're actually getting from the sun, it's really all there is to it. And then on top of that, the lunar celebrations and cycles coincide and work together with the sun because, as you might know, their orbits are tied together. The moon is not only just orbiting around the Earth, it has an elliptical orbit because it's also being pulled by the sun. So they still coincide and work together. And so you can use them cohesively with the solar celebrations as well. They don't have to be separate. And they can also, help you just clarify, because these solar celebrations only happen, a couple times a year, and the lunar cycles are much more frequent. So you can just kind of refine your focus a little bit more, and then whenever the solar celebration comes up, you are already kind of like into a natural cycle, you're already kind of synced up, and you can just be more in tune with that energy. That is what I have found, at least. So that's it. That's all I really wanted to share about St. Patrick's Day and clearing up some of the discrepancies about the myths that are out there, where they may have come from, and why it's still important to tell as many versions as are available, because I feel like they all have their place somewhere. They all exist, don't they? So, yeah. I think this stuff is really fun to learn about. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope that you at least learned something if you watched this whole thing. And I am going to, in the spirit of Celtic tradition, I'm gonna cook some tasty food, and then I am going to do some art while listening to music and just kind of let the creative juices flow, see what kind of story I have to tell, and that'll really do it for the rest of the day. So, quarter of the way done after that, and yeah. Thank you guys for joining me, and I'll catch you later.